Today, we become legends.
Patch 11.8 brings massive sweeping nerfs to top performers and huge buffs to underperforming gods and items. Here's your quick patch day breakdown of everything you need to know. Kicking things off as always with the new skins, Bitblaster Apollo and Fletched Fun Artemis are in the Immortal Honor event, and Shard Soul Chak and Hell's Fury Mercury are in the new cross-gen pass. Some small rebalancings of buffs and totems has been made to Conquest, with green buff now taking less protections to get the max health and mana out of it, and blue buff getting an increase to its mana restoration passive. Gold totem has its flat penetration nerfed, green totem has its max health and mana buffed, and the red totem has its lifesteal buff. Gold Fury's base health has been reduced and its gold reward has been increased as well. Moving into item balance, first up we have some nerfs to top performing returning items from last patch. Hasten Fatalis gets a 100 gold cost increase, Shifter's Shield also gets a 100 gold cost increase. Hide of the Nemean Lion's reflect damage goes from 15% down to 12.5%, Shield of the Phoenix loses 50 base health, Assie's physical power has been reduced from 40 to 35, Soul Eater now only gains the flat penetration on evolution of the item, not on its base. Wing Shard's duration of the buff effect has been increased from 3 seconds to 5 seconds. Devourer's Gauntlet got a 100 gold cost reduction. Bladed Boomerang's buff effect now lasts 10 seconds, up from 6 seconds before this patch. Wingblade gets a slew of buffs with 5 more magical protections, 50 more health, and 10% more CCR. Dawnbringer also gets some big buffs with a 50 gold cost reduction, 50 more health, and an increase to its passive duration after ulting. Heartward Amulet gets a 50 gold cost reduction and 50 more health as well as 200 base mana has been added to the item. Spear of the Magus gets a 50 gold cost reduction, and its internal cooldown on applying the mark has been almost halved. Curse Weaver's max health and mana damage from the passive has been increased from 5% to 7.5%. Rod of Tahuti gets 10 more magical power. Charon's Coin's flip effect now grants 15 gold per flip instead of 1 gold before. Stone of Gaia now grants its passive power when the knockup regen effect is not active instead of when it is active. Equinox's passive damage when hitting from behind has been increased from 2 to 3 per level. Abyssal Stone's cooldown on applying the passive has been completely removed. Erosion's passive cooldown has been decreased from 10 seconds to 4 seconds, meaning you can now have permanent uptime on it. Archmage's Gem gets a big increase to its magical power from 85 to 120. Rejuvenating Heart gets 10 more magical power and a 15 unit increase on its passive effect range. Crimson Claws gets a 100 gold cost reduction as well as trading 5 physical power for 10% lifesteal. Pythagorum's Piece gets a 100 gold cost reduction and 3% more lifesteal. Bancroft's Claw's internal cooldown has been reduced from 15 seconds to 10 seconds, and the max health damage and shield on the passive has been increased from 0.5% to 1%. Amulet of Silence got its passive range increased from 40 to 55 units, and the internal cooldown has been decreased from 12 seconds to 8 seconds. Perfected Rod of Tahuti's buff duration has been increased from 3 seconds to 6 seconds. Reverent Pridwin's shield health has been increased from 200% of your protections to 225%. Breastplate of Vigilance's passive range has been increased from 60 units to 70 units. And finally for items, Malicious Deathbringer's cooldown effect now applies to your ultimate ability as well as your basic abilities. Moving on to god changes for 11.8 though, first up are some nerfs to the top performers. Eshell's damage on her alternate form 1 has been decreased, and the bonus damage scaling has been reduced as well, and her ultimate also no longer has damage mitigation while channeling. Jonqui's protections per demon in his bag has been reduced from 1.6 to 1.3. King Arthur's HP 5 has been completely removed from his passive, and his 1 in both stances now starts at 16 seconds and scales down to 14 rather than 14 seconds at all ranks. Mulan's training speed on all 3 abilities has been reduced, and her 2 also gets a 1 second cooldown increase. Medusa's Viper Shot now has 2% less scaling per tick, her Acid Spray now is 15 seconds scaling down to 13 rather than 13 seconds flat, and her ultimate damage has been reduced. Freya's 1 bonus damage has been nerfed by 5 at all ranks and 5% scaling, her 2's cooldown has been increased by 1 second, and her ultimate has been increased by 10 seconds. And finally for nerfs, Changa's 1 and ultimate have both received small damage reductions. Moving into some buffs though, first up, Jingwei gets more base attack speed per level, her 2 now scales down to 10 seconds at max rank rather than 12 seconds flat. Her 3 is now 16 seconds flat rather than 18 down to 16, and her air power and duration have been increased on this ability. Kumbhakana gets a massive round of buffs this patch with more base physical protection. His first 2 attacks in his chain now cleave. He restores at more health and mana after sleeping and now gains 20 HP 5 while this passive is on cooldown. His 1 gets a mana cost reduction and lower cooldown. His 2's root is no longer affected by DR, making it much better to use after his 3 and or ult. ult, but the root duration overall has been nerfed to compensate for this. His 3 now deals damage if the target awakens early, the mez duration has been shifted to be stronger at early ranks but weaker at later ones, and the slow and attack speed slow after waking up have also been nerfed. But he also gets a mana cost reduction to this ability, and his ultimate gets a 5-second cooldown reduction as well. Okay, moving on, next up is Maui, who gets some pretty major buffs with more base attack speed, more base basic attack power, and more basic attack power per level. His 1's charge time has been roughly halved, and his projectile speed has been increased by roughly 10%. His 2's protection buff and movement speed buff have both been increased, and finally his 3's cooldown has been reduced by 1 second. Next up is Bake Kujira, whose 1 now scales down in cooldown from 14 seconds to 12 rather than 14 seconds at all ranks. His 2 gets a small damage buff, and his 3 now stuns for 1.5 seconds at all ranks rather than 0.5 seconds scaling up to 1.5. Anubis also gets some buffs with more base health and health per level, an increased duration on his passive buffs, more damage scaling and a lower cooldown on his 1, and his 2 now stuns for 2 seconds at all ranks rather than 1.6 scaling up to 2. Hale gets more mana per level, mana cost reductions to her 2 in both stances, more damage scaling on her 3 in dark stance, and more movement speed on her 3 in light stance. Huyi gets more attack speed per level, his 1 now scales down in cooldown to 8 seconds rather than 10 seconds at all ranks, and his 3 gets a reduced mana cost. Hunbat's passive basic attack damage effect has been increased from 15% to 20%, the bounce range of his monkey has been increased, and the deploy range of his ultimate is now 45 units instead of 35. Tier's ultimate now scales down from 90 seconds to 70 rather than 90 seconds at all ranks. Pele's passive power has been increased, the duration of the buff has also been increased, and the cooldown has been decreased by 10 seconds, and her 2 also gets a small damage increase. Bakasura's passive power from his 3 is now 5 power stronger at all ranks, and his ultimate now deals tick damage to enemies in the cripple area, as well as the cone basic attacks now scaling up in duration from 6 seconds to 10 seconds rather than 6 seconds at all ranks as it was before. Ula's 1 in bow stance gets a damage increase, his 3 in bow stance gets a mana cost reduction, and his 3 in axe stance gets the same mana cost reduction and a 5% power scaling increase. Vamana's 1 gets a 2-second cooldown reduction, his 3's projectile speed has been increased and widened, and his ultimate shield is now 0.9% max health per tick, up from 0.75% before. Discordia's 1 projectile speed has been increased, and her 3's range goes from 30 units to 40, and now also reduces her ultimate cooldown by 0.5 seconds per tick. Hades gets a 1-second cooldown reduction at all ranks of his 2, his 3 gets a large base damage increase but a reduction to the detonate damage to compensate, making it a lot more damaging to single targets but slightly less to multiple enemies. His ultimate also gets a 5% power scaling increase per tick. Kali's passive penetration on her target has been increased from 0.25% per level to 0.5%, her passive power from incense has been increased by 5 at all ranks, and her ultimate's power scaling has been increased by 2% per tick. And finally, Artemis gets more base and per level health, enemies taking damage from her traps are now revealed to everyone on Artemis's team for the duration, and her 2 is now 14 seconds at all ranks instead of 16 scaling down to 14. But that's everything you need to know to jump into patch 11.8. Good luck in your games, and I'll catch you guys for another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.